Hey guys, this is Amber Rain Davis from NotableInk.com, and I am so excited to share 7 tips to layer stamp with realism. You can see that I have an inspiration photo here that heavily inspired this technique that I'm going to share with you today. I think it's really unique to layer stamp with your darkest colors first, so I'm excited to share that. Here's the second card, and both of these cards are for the Altenew September Build-A-Flower release. This month's release is for Build-A-Flower Hellebore, and it's absolutely gorgeous. You can see it here. As always, coordinating dies come with the Build-A-Flower sets, and if you weren't aware, Altenew offers a Build-A-Flower monthly subscription plan at a discounted price. With that, you are guaranteed to get a set when it releases. So I'll have a link below if you are interested in that plan. Let's go ahead and get started with our first tip. My first tip for layer stamping with realism is to choose an inspiration photo. So some flowers from real life. I don't always look up the real flowers and what colors they come in before stamping because I might have a color palette in mind already, or maybe I want to do something more whimsical or fantasy-like. So I Googled Hellebore, and this is a great photo of many of the different varieties that are available. I really was astonished by how many different colors and variations they came in. They all look so different to me, and this is like a playground for this technique. You could choose any one of these and use the techniques and tips that I'm going to share today in order to get a similar bloom to what you see here. So that's super exciting. You can go back and do this with whatever your favorite color variation is. Then you want to study the color and texture of the blooms that you've chosen in your inspiration photos. This is going to be really important because normally in layer stamping you completely ink up the layer, but in this particular case, due to the texture or the finish of the petals, you may need to do something different for realism. So here, for instance, these are the 2 inspiration photos I've chosen, and you can see that the finish of the dark and handsome blooms is a little chalky and waxy looking. So that got me thinking, when I saw this photo, I was immediately like, oh my gosh, I can make that. I can layer stamp that. What I need to do is pull out my Oxide inks because that's got the chalky finish. Same with the photo on the right, that's a little more chalky in appearance. It's not a super shiny petal. And I was really attracted to the kind of brownish purplish veins that are on the leaves. So I'm going to be incorporating all of that into my stamping. So first thing that I'm going to do is start testing my color choices. So I've studied my inspiration photos. I've picked an ink that I think might work. This is Cosmic Berry from the Rose Petal Altenew Crisp Dye Ink family. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that down. And already I'm thinking this is way too purple, too bright, just way too bright. And that's why I've brought my photo over. That's another one of my tips that I don't have written down on any of these slides is keep your inspiration photo handy. Keep it next to you while you're designing so you can refer back to it frequently. Now I've inked up the second layer with Galactic Stream, and again, both of these colors are just way too vibrant. So I pulled out my inspiration photo again and decided I need a raisin color, and Grapevine would be perfect. So after testing out these layers that didn't work so well, I've reestablished what colors I want to use, and I've also noted that I need to do some partial ink layering. So I don't want to fully ink up each one of my layers because these petals have some texture on it and variance in color. So I'm going to fully ink up the first layer of the stamp set, and then this is in Grapevine ink. So that is part of the Red Cosmos family. And this to me was a great ink. It was a little too raisiny. So I've got a really nice base coat there, but you could see in the flower that there was a little bit of a brighter pink. So what I've done is I've pulled out my Distress Oxide Seedless Preserves. I'm going to go ahead and press the ink pad directly onto the stamp, but I'm kind of rock and rolling it so that I'm only inking up the edges. Then I'm going to take a sponge dauber and smooth out some of those harsh edges, and that is a great color. So Grapevine and Seedless Preserves Oxide ink together were perfect for this. So now I have Galactic Stream again, and you can see I've kind of lightly pounced the ink pad on the second layer stamp because, again, I don't want it fully inked up. I want some of the Seedless preserves and grapevine to show through, and I kind of want a grainy appearance to this. Now, as we said before, the Galactic Stream was a little too bright, so I'm going to dial that back. This is still the layer 2 stamp. I'm going to ink up the edges of the stamp with black soot, Distress Oxide, and I'm just going to soften up some of the edges of the ink with a sponge dauber. Now, while that dialed it back some, I felt like now I needed to dial back my grapevine and Seedless preserve edges. So we're going to pull out layer 1 again, and tip number 4 is restamp your layers for added depth. So if you need to dial something back, if you need to add some shading to a layer, because remember, each one of these layers is just a flat color. So I'm going to dial it back. So I'm going back to the number 1 layer, so layer 1 of the stamp set for this large bloom. I'm going to take black soot around the edges, and that's going to add some shading to that kind of the purple outline that we had around this bloom. So we're moving on to layer 3, and I've pulled out milled lavender Distress Oxide. So I have to start getting some of that chalky appearance in there. So here I've inked that up, and I'm like, no, I'm not loving this. Yes, it's giving me my chalky appearance, but I'm not sure it's exactly the layer that I wanted to do that on, because that's supposed to be the shadow layer, right? So I'm rethinking what I'm doing. I'm going back to the first layer again. So now this is the 3rd time that we're using layer 1. Now I'm bringing that back black soot in further into the stamp. So not just the outside, but kind of bringing it in further. We're getting a little closer. So we're getting a lot of depth to this bloom. You can see I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? How do I want to fix this? Now, the black soot, even though it's really dark, is still a little bit chalky. And this was kind of amazing to me. So I've inked up layer 3 with Obsidian Black Pigment Ink, because again, that's the shadow layer, right? And bam, look at that. That's amazing. I was so excited, you guys. So I have my really dark, deep layer, but because I've added the black soot and then also some of the Seedless preserves, I have that chalky appearance. We're getting a lot closer to what this actual bloom looks like. And also, how cool is it to do layer stamping with dark colors? I mean, I just think that's really cool and unique. I mean, I was really excited. So here I'm going to do the middle, and for whatever reason, I didn't test this out on a scrap piece of paper. So I went in with bamboo for the first layer of the center. Then I'm going to do the detail layer with Shabby shutters, because holy moly, bamboo is one vibrant color, right? So we need to dial that back with our Distress Oxide Shabby shutters. That has dialed it back some, but I'm going to revisit these centers later on because they're not exactly where I want them to be yet. The centers in the photo are a little bit more yellow. There's definitely some white in there. So I'll leave that for now and move on to the smaller blooms. Now, another tip that I don't have written down in a slide is write down your steps. Write down the colors that you've used and write down the stamps that you use. Because remember, we used layer stamp 1 3 or 4 times. So I'm going to speed through these smaller stamps because it's a similar process. It's not exactly the same because I didn't write down my steps until I got to this bloom. And so here we can see the finished flowers compared to the inspiration photo, which I think look great. I'm really happy with those. So then what I'm going to do is refer back to the inspiration photo for my card design, not only for how to arrange the blooms, but also for maybe what type of background I want. I'm going to use my inspiration photo for that. So here we can see primarily the blooms. So we're not seeing any of the stems. We're seeing some leaves behind it. So I'm going to use that in my design choices. I'm not going to do stems on these. I'm going to do just the blooms and arrangement of the blooms and have some leaves peeking out. I've also decided to use a stencil. This is the Altenew Sketched Line stencil. And I'm just going to do some ink blending with bamboo ink. And I didn't mention it before, but I will have all of the products that I use down below so that you don't have to be writing everything down. And I'll have all the specific colors and orders listed in my blog post, so be sure to check that out. So I'm going to ink up just a small portion of the stencil. I've die cut my flowers with the coordinating dies, and I'm going to start creating an arrangement here. So what I ended up doing was 1 large bloom, 2 small, and a bud. Normally I would do an odd number of flowers, but I really wanted to use the bud. So I actually have 4 flowers, but I think I have an odd number of leaf clusters. The next thing we're going to do is add some details with pens. So I didn't really feel like I got it all the way there with those centers. So I'm going to add some additional detail with a white Jelly Roll pen. So if you're missing something, sometimes a black pen, a white pen, or maybe a different color pen can get you the rest of the way. So I have a white Jelly Roll pen here. I believe it's an 08 and it's by Sakura. And I'm just going to add some additional detail. The bamboo and the Shabby shutters were a little close together. You'll see when we do the second card, I didn't need to use pen for those centers at all. The 2 colors that I used were far enough apart that there was distinction between the detail layer and the base layer. So this adds that little extra something that I needed. So you can see for the leaves, I just did standard layer stamping and I used the tropical forest colors for that. Moving on to my second card, you can see that I tested colors. I did the first layer in white ink. That's a no-go. Why I even tried it, I'm not sure. The second set you see is Tattered Rose Distress Oxide, rock and rolled around the edges of the stamp and then softened with a sponge dauber. And I liked that, but when I looked at my inspiration photo again, I could see that there was more green than pink in the stamps. So here I have inked up the second layer with Shabby Shutters, Distress Oxide, and again, I didn't do it uniformly. So what I like most is the first layer with the Tattered Rose, that's in the middle, with the second layer with Shabby Shutters. So now I've come in with the third layer with Olive, just crisp dye ink from Altenew, and then I'm adding to the same layer just a touch of moss ink so that there'll be a gradation, so that it's darker at the base and in the center of the largest bloom at the base of the smaller blooms. Here I'm going back to layer 1 and I'm going to add the Tattered Rose Distress Oxide. I actually add a couple layers of that to get it up to the amount of saturation that I want to see, because here you can see some of those petals have those pink edges, but the majority of the flower is that green color. And I really like that. Here I'm studying the center to see what I need to do with that. Now this time I've learned from my previous mistake and I'm going to test this out first so that I can get my color combination before I go right in. So I tried milled lavender Distress Oxide. Here I have antique linen. So I've done my base number 1 layer of the center in butter cream, Altenew ink, and then I'm going to do my detail layer in antique linen Distress Oxide. And there's a large enough variation between those 2 colors that I don't need to add more detail with a pen. Moving on to the leaves. So the leaves on this variety of Hellebore are unique in that they're green and they also have those purple veins down the stem and also at the back side of the leaves. So I've inked everything up in Shabby Shutters. And then I'm going in with the second layer in olive ink, and I'm not inking it up completely. I'm kind of partially inking it up. Here I'm taking a look at the stems again to see what color I want to use there. And what I'm doing is I'm using the same second layer and I'm sponging on Seedless Preserves Distress Oxide. So I don't want really thick layers of that. I don't want it to be too vibrant, which is why I'm using the sponge dauber. For the third layer, I'm coming in with moss ink from Altenew. That's from the Tropical Forest. And then with the same third layer, I'm then going in with Seedless Preserves and sponge daubing that on. And I have to say, I love how these leaves turn out, and I love the mix of the purple and the green to add just a touch of a brownish tone to it. I think that combination is really pretty. So now for the second card, we're going to go back to tip 5 and refer back to our inspiration photo for our card design. So here we can see some stems, we can see some leaves. They're mostly in a vertical pattern, so I feel like I want to do a grouping of long stemmed hellebores kind of coming up, mostly the center of the card. For the background, I've decided to use the same stencil, but instead of stenciling, I'm going to dry emboss the pattern onto an A2 size piece of cardstock instead of doing any inking. So tip number 7 is to improvise. So if you remember back to the beginning, and I'll show it in just a second, this particular stamp set doesn't have long stems, so I'm going to need to draw them. But I'm also going to need to match the coloring and the layering. Otherwise, a flat one color stem is going to look pretty strange. So here's the stamp set here. You can see that there's some short stems, but I want these really tall long stems. So here you can see I've dry embossed my A2 size card panel. I've splattered it with Shabby Shutter's Distress Oxide ink, and I've arranged my blooms here. So I've got 5 blooms. I've got a nice odd number. I've die cut all my leaves, and I'm ready to start figuring out where these stems go. So I'm going to take a tip from Jennifer McGuire and use some Glad press and seal to keep all of my die cuts together. And what I'm going to do is then take a pencil and mark where my stems need to come down. So I'm going to do that right through the press and seal. I'm just going to mark the top of where that stem needs to start. And then I'll go ahead and take my blooms off. They'll stay in their arrangement, and I'll go ahead and start my stems. One of the things to take note when you're doing stems like this is you want to arrange your flowers, and you can see me adjusting it here so that your stems don't overlap. You want some space in between your stems, otherwise it might not read like 2 separate stems because these aren't going to have a huge amount of detail in them, nor are they going to be very realistic. So I'm starting off with I'm just using the bullet nib of my Altenew artist markers. This is in frayed leaf. And I started with the first 3 stems. I'm going to take a look at my flowers again, make sure everything is looking good. And I'm going to make any adjustments that I need because on the left here, my stems were going to be really quite close together. So I'm just reestablishing that one and the one on the right. And then I'll go ahead and do those 2 stems. The first layer of my stems is complete, and then I come in with Forest Glades marker, and what I really should have chosen was olive because that was the color ink pad that I used, but I didn't want to use bamboo from that family for the bottom layer because that's way too bright. So I end up adjusting this later. So if you do the same color palette, you could use frayed leaf in the olive marker. Then I kind of wanted the same chalky appearance. So what I have here is a really small blending brush. These are just the brushes, the cheap makeup brushes from Amazon. And I just blended on a little bit of that Shabby Shutter's Distress Oxide. And then I wise up and actually grab the olive marker. Now, again, we added so many different layers with our layer stamping, so I want lots of layers with my stems as well. Now here I have the Grapevine artist marker, and important to note, as I'm drawing this, I'm not doing a complete line. I'm kind of dotting on my line so that it's a little grainy and choppy and has texture like the flowers do. I'll blend on a little more Shabby Shutters and then grab 2 different thicknesses of foam squares so that I can pop up my flowers. And I fiddle around with this forever, so I won't make you watch the whole thing. I went ahead and stamped my sentiments from sentiment strips with Shabby Shutters and cut those out in strips. Because if you follow me, you know that I don't think about my sentiments before I start adding everything to the card, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to fit a sentiment on there. So I had no room, and I didn't want to cover up all that beautiful work that I did, so I ended up doing the strips vertically. And normally, if I were going to do that, I would do 3 sentiments, but I actually had planned on sending this to someone, and those sentiments worked best. So that's what I stuck with just the 2. I added some Nouveau crystal drops in Simply White, and that's the finished card from the original concept photo to the end. Here's the first card, and this sentiment is from Reason to Smile stamp set from Altenew, and I thought it was such a perfect sentiment for this flower because I really do feel like this flower is a limited edition. It's not typical that you see a flower like that in nature, nor a layer stamping on a card like this, so I thought it was just perfect. I think I might have stamped You Are in both Purple Wine and Cosmic Berry, or it might have been, I don't know. It was a combination of colors that I used for You Are to get a matching color. And then a limited edition is in Obsidian Black Pigment Ink. And lastly, I added some Ebony Nouveau drops. Here are the two finished cards together, and I had such an amazing time kind of breaking out of my typical mold that I use for layer stamping, which is, for the most part, I stick with my 4 colors in one color family. I might mix the color families, but I don't normally add oxides to it or and I usually only use one layer one time. So each layer one time. So reusing layers to continue to add depth and to continue to add partial stamping to get closer and closer to that realistic photo inspiration was such a blast. I was so inspired by these photos, and I really hope that you are equally as inspired by these techniques and will give them a try. If you do, please tag me on Instagram at Notable Ink. I would love to see what you guys are creating, especially if you use different color combinations, or maybe pick one of those different flowers at the very beginning of this video. Thank you so much for watching today. If you enjoyed this video, the best way that you can support me and my channel is to hit the like button below, subscribe if you haven't already, share this video on your social media channels so that it gets out there more often, and also to use my affiliate links down below should you need any of these products. I get a small portion of the sale at no cost to you so that I can create new content. So those really are the best ways that you can support me and keep that new content coming your way. Thanks again for joining me today. I will have my blog post linked down below if you are interested in the specific steps or the specific inks that I used. And have a fantastic day. Until next time, breathe, ink, inspire.